There is a saying that is recognized across virtually all industries, which sadly has generally proven to be true time and time again throughout the years. That saying being, safety regulations are written in blood, meaning quite obviously that safety regulations often only come about as the result of an incident or incidents that have resulted in an alarming loss of human life, subsequently resulting in preventative measures and regulations being implemented in their wake, aimed at preventing such occurrences from unfolding again in the future. Interestingly, thus far on the channel, I've only covered one such incident that resulted in governmental regulations in its wake, with that video being one of the first few videos I posted on the channel actually, which detailed the deadly Jordan High School bus crash in Utah that resulted in the requirement that school buses always come to a complete stop at railroad crossings. The topic of today's video, however, would prompt the implementation of much more significant and extensive governmental regulations in its aftermath, forever changing the landscape of the American pharmaceutical industry. In the early 1900s in the United States, the medical and pharmaceutical industries as a whole were vastly different industries when compared to their contemporary counterparts. Both's growth fueled by a rapidly evolving understanding of human physiology, anatomy, and chemistry, which would see a general increase in effective medical treatment rendered by doctors, and thanks to the latter, more effective and varied medicines being introduced to the market at a steady yet brisk pace. However, the contents of these medicines and the determination as to whether they were actually safe to provide to patients was left entirely up to the pharmaceutical company producing them. With the chemistry knowledge and expertise of these companies' chemists and their awareness of potentially harmful interactions between various substances and chemicals being the only protections provided to consumers to prevent potential poisonings. In practice, this meant that most new medicines introduced to the market at the time were formulated by projecting a medicine's potential effectiveness entirely determined by its listed active ingredients rather than through conducting pre-market trials, as it was standard practice to conduct little to no testing of new medicines before introducing them to the market. The glaring flaws of these commonplace practices would become tragically apparent in the latter half of the year 1937, however, when a Tennessee-based pharmaceutical company, the S.E. Massengill Company, would introduce their newest sulfonamide antibiotic concoction to the market, known as Elixir Sulfanilamide, the Elixir of Death. The concept for the creation of Elixir Sulfanilamide was first conceived by one of the S.E. Massengill Company's traveling salesmen earlier in 1937, with the salesman reporting that there was a high demand for sulfanilamide, one of the most popular and effective antibiotics available at the time, in liquid form as opposed to its typical tablet or powder form currently available on the market. Thus, the S.E. Massengill Company's chief chemist and pharmacist, a man named Harold Cole Watkins, was set to work conducting experiments and crafting a concoction to fill this newly ascertained market niche. Throughout his ensuing experiments, Mr. Watkins would discover that powdered sulfanilamide could be effectively and stably viscosified using liquid diethylene glycol as a solvent, with this dark red-colored solvent also serving another beneficial purpose for Mr. Watkins's new medicinal concoction as well, as diethylene glycol has a naturally sweet taste, and thus this would lessen the need for additional non-active additives and sweeteners to improve the medicine's taste. His newly dubbed concoction, Elixir Sulfanilamide, was then subsequently sent to the S.E. Massengill Company's control lab, which would then test the new medicine using their standard testing procedures, testing for, quote, flavor, appearance, and fragrance, and found it satisfactory, the control lab's evaluation read. Following the stamp of approval from the control lab, the S.E. Massengill Company would begin production of 240 gallons of Elixir Sulfanilamide, which was then divided into 633 different shipments that were subsequently distributed to medical professionals and pharmacies across the country, spanning from Virginia to California. By the first week of September of 1937, many of these Elixir Sulfanilamide shipments had reached their intended recipients and were given to patients as a liquid alternative to sulfanilamide tablets and powders, which, tragically, was usually deemed as the simplest method for children to ingest the antibiotic. It wouldn't be long before many of the doctors who had provided the medicine to their patients would begin to report that these patients did not recover from their illnesses as expected, but rather their physical conditions would instead begin to rapidly further deteriorate, often subsequently resulting in the afflicted patient's prolonged and agonizing demise over the course of several days after ingesting the deadly Elixir Sulfanilamide. After it had been on the market for just a few days, a New York City-based doctor would begin to connect the dots between his patient's mysteriously deteriorating conditions and Elixir Sulfanilamide, and would immediately reach out to FDA inspectors with his suspicions regarding the deadly medication. On September 14th, a federal Food and Drug Administration inspector would confirm that a total of 8 children and 1 adult had perished after ingesting Elixir Sulfanilamide, and subsequently discovered that the deadly medicine had been manufactured by the S.E. Massengill Company in Tennessee. Following this discovery, the S.E. Massengill Company would send out over 1,000 product recall telegrams to salesmen, doctors, and pharmacists across the United States, urging them to return all previously received shipments of Elixir Sulfanilamide back to the company's headquarters in Tennessee. Notably, however, likely in an effort to mitigate the reputational damage inflicted to the company, these initial recall telegrams would not specify a reason for the recall, leading many unassuming medical professionals and pharmacists across the country opting to disregard the recall messages, and with no indication of its potential lethality in the recall notices, most assumed the recalls were for little more than an unintentionally foul taste or the like. Thus, as some medical professionals would continue to dose and prescribe Elixir Sulfanilamide to their patients, the string of unusual, slow, and agonizing deaths linked to the toxic tonic would continue to mount throughout the following weeks. Now, before I reveal the total number of poisoning deaths attributed to ingesting Elixir Sulfanilamide suffered throughout the months of September and October of 1937, as well as the resulting aftermath, I'd like to clarify for those of you watching who aren't particularly familiar with either advanced chemistry nor historic mass poisonings, what exactly made Elixir Sulfanilamide such a particularly lethal concoction in the first place. The answer to this query is quite simply the sweet-tasting dark red solvent used to viscosify the active sulfanilamide, diethylene glycol. Diethylene glycol is a notably versatile solvent that, in modern times, is almost exclusively used in the manufacturing processes of plastics and polyesters. However, I believe many of you watching this video might also recognize diethylene glycol as the toxic ingredient that was added to over 1 million bottles of Austrian wine in 1985 as a sweetener and to increase the profit margins of these dubious Austrian wineries. However, even if you don't happen to be familiar with the aforementioned incident in 1985, it is highly likely that you are at least passively aware of the deadliness of one of diethylene glycol's closest chemical and molecular analogs, monoethylene glycol, otherwise known as antifreeze. While monoethylene glycol and diethylene glycol are molecularly extremely similar, as any chemist will readily attest, similar does not mean that they are the same. and generally speaking, diethylene glycol is less toxic to humans overall than monoethylene glycol, with a lethal dose of the former estimated to be between 1 and 1.63 grams per kilogram of body weight, with the latter's lethal dose measured to be 786 milligrams per kilogram of body weight. Now, without delving too deep into the nitty-gritty of the metabolic specifics, simply put, thanks to the close molecular similarities between them, diethylene glycol and monoethylene glycol are metabolized by the human body in an extremely similar manner, and thus, the symptoms of diethylene glycol poisoning and monoethylene glycol poisoning manifest in very similar and excruciatingly agonizing manners. Common onset symptoms of diethylene glycol poisoning similarly closely mirror those of antifreeze poisoning, with the first phase of symptoms manifesting as a multitude of gastrointestinal issues including abdominal pain, nausea, vomiting, and diarrhea, as well as several potential neurological symptoms such as central nervous system depression, mild hypotension, altered mental status, and sometimes even coma. The symptoms of the second stage of diethylene glycol poisoning, which typically begin to manifest approximately 1 to 3 days after ingesting the poison, typically include symptoms such as metabolic acidosis, which is a condition that causes acute kidney failure, and oliguria, a condition marked by notably decreased urine output, which later often devolves into anuria, or failure to urinate at all. Furthermore, this second stage of diethylene glycol poisoning is often also marked by the formation of calcium oxalate crystals in the kidneys, which also further accelerates the symptoms of kidney failure in victims. Further second stage diethylene glycol poisoning symptoms also include several cardiac symptoms as well, including an increased heart rate, hypertension, as well as pancreatitis, hyperkalemia, or an excessive amount of potassium in the blood, as well as hyponatremia, or lowered levels of sodium in the blood. Victims who do manage to endure the agonizing symptoms of the first 2 stages of diethylene glycol poisoning for about 5 to 10 days will enter into the third and final stage of poisoning symptoms, which consist largely of major neurological symptoms, with third stage symptoms including a hoarse, raspy voice, facial paralysis, increasing lethargy, quadriplegia, coma, and inevitably, eventually culminating in death for most victims. Now, interestingly, one of the most effective and primarily utilized antidotes to counteract diethylene glycol poisoning is the consumption of ethanol, specifically at blood alcohol concentration levels between 0.06 and 0.08 grams per liter of the victim's blood, meaning that an effective antidote to diethylene glycol poisoning is to get legally drunk. As the death toll attributed to Elixir Sulfanilamide only continued to rise following the initial recall announcement sent out on September 14th, FDA inspectors would insist that the S.E. Massengill Company issue a second wave of recall telegrams, specifically denoting the potential repercussions of administering or distributing Elixir Sulfanilamide to patients and the urgency of returning all product to the manufacturer immediately, with this second round of telegrams reading, quote, "Imperative you take up immediately all Elixir Sulfanilamide dispensed. Product may be dangerous to life. Return all stocks, our expense," it read. Over the following weeks, 239 FDA inspectors and chemists, which was a majority of the agency's staff at the time, set to work meticulously tracing all of the previously distributed stock of Elixir Sulfanilamide, as well as identifying potential poisoning victims, going to great lengths to look through thousands of receipts, prescriptions, doctor's records, and records of S.E. Massengill Company salesmen in an effort to prevent any future poisoning deaths as well as identify any potentially previously recently deceased victims whose deaths fit the symptoms of, but had not yet been previously tied to the lethal Elixir Sulfanilamide, and ultimately FDA inspectors would manage to recover a total of 234 gallons and 1 pint of the 240 gallons of Elixir Sulfanilamide that had been distributed prior to the recall, with the remaining missing amount determined to have been roughly the amount that had caused the numerous deaths, which now numbered 105 victims across 15 different states, by the time that FDA inspectors had managed to recover the remaining product potentially available to the public. In the immediate aftermath of the widespread poisonings, the general public, families of the victims, and many of the doctors who had personally administered the lethal concoction to their patients alike would express their outrage as to how such a lethal medicine had managed to hit the market in the first place, coupled with feelings of grief, guilt, and shock that the victims had mostly been seeking treatment for sore throats attributed to strep throat, as they watched the victims suffer the agonizing symptoms I detailed earlier in the video, with Elixir Sulfanilamide victims typically suffering for a prolonged period of between 7 and 21 days before most ultimately succumbed to kidney failure. One such doctor who had prescribed Elixir Sulfanilamide to his patients, subsequently resulting in their deaths, would write in a letter dated October 22, 1937, quote, "Nobody but Almighty God and I can know what I've been through these past few days. I've been familiar with death in the years since I received my MD from Tulane University School of Medicine with the rest of my class of 1911. Covington County has been my home. I've practiced here for years. Any doctor who has practiced more than quarter of a century has seen his share of death. But to realize that 6 human beings, all of them my patients, one of them my best friend, are dead because they took a medicine that I prescribed for them innocently, and to realize that that medicine which I had used for years in such cases suddenly had become a deadly poison in its newest and most modern form, as recommended by a great and reputable pharmaceutical firm in Tennessee. Well, that realization has given me such days and nights of mental and spiritual agony as I did not believe a human being could undergo and survive. I have known hours when death for me would be a welcome relief from this agony," his letter read. Similarly, the mother of a young girl named Joan, who perished after ingesting Elixir Sulfanilamide, would heartbreakingly write in a letter to President Franklin Roosevelt, quote, "The first time I ever had the occasion to call in a doctor for Joan, and she was given Elixir of Sulfanilamide. All that is left to us is the caring for her little grave. Even the memory of her is mixed with sorrow, for we can see her little body tossing to and fro and hear that little voice screaming with pain, and it seems as though it would drive me insane. It is my plea that you will take steps to prevent such sales of drugs that will take little lives and leave such suffering behind and such a bleak outlook on the future as I have tonight," her letter read. Over the following months, public outrage surrounding the poisonings continued to bubble over, and federal investigators would begin building a case against the S.E. Massengill Company, much to the delight of the general public and the surviving families of the victims, who were eager to see the company held legally responsible for their procedural negligence, which had led to the 105 deaths. While both federal investigators and the S.E. Massengill Company were awaiting the upcoming trial, set to take place in 1938, there would be one additional death directly linked to Elixir Sulfanilamide, as the S.E. Massengill Company's head chemist, the man who had originally devised the concoction, Harold Cole Watkins, would take his own life, overwhelmed by feelings of grief and guilt that his concoction had been the cause of so many deaths across the nation. At trial, the S.E. Massengill Company itself would seemingly not share in any of Mr. Watkins's guilt, and the pharmaceutical company would argue in court that they had done nothing wrong and had followed all established pharmaceutical manufacturing laws, guidelines, and procedures to the book at the time. The prosecution would argue that the deaths could have been prevented entirely had the product been animal tested on essentially any mammal species before going to market. However, as I noted earlier on in this video, such tests were not standard practice, nor were they required by law at the time. Ultimately, the conclusion of the trial would find that the S.E. Massengill Company was not liable or legally responsible for the deaths, as the court would rule that the company didn't violate any laws or manufacturing guidelines that would make them legally liable or responsible for the deaths. However, the court would ultimately issue the company a slap on the wrist with the minimum fine for labeling the deadly medicine as an elixir, which, as defined by the 1906 Food and Drug Act, were required to contain ethanol as an ingredient, while Elixir Sulfanilamide was found to contain no ethanol whatsoever. However, despite the company responsible for producing this so-called Elixir of Death being largely let off the hook, legally speaking, for the poisonings, the victims' deaths would serve as the catalyst for the passage of the 1938 Food, Drugs, and Cosmetics Act, which contained much more stringent rules and regulations regarding pharmaceutical product manufacturing and testing before distribution, leaving a long-lasting impact on the medical and pharmaceutical industries still felt to this day. Thank you all for watching.